Howdy, and welcome to Brandy's Book Stack. I'm Brandy, and today I thought we would talk about books that no one's talking about. Well, at least almost no one. The books I'm going to talk about today are books that I think are really great novels, and yet I haven't heard a lot of buzz or talk about them on the internet. There's going to be a mix of classics, of fantasy, science fiction, and a little bit of horror even, a genre I don't read very much. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is actually a book that is sort of a cheat, because there is a YouTuber that talked about this, but only one. Michael K. Vaughan is hosting a really fun book challenge, book club called Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, where every month he reads a book that is available in the public domain for absolutely free. So it's a great idea, and it's been a lot of fun so far. It's not too late to jump in, and if you haven't been on Michael K. Vaughan's channel, you should really check it out. Even though he and I don't have very similar reading tastes, I still really enjoy watching his channel. So, and I've picked up some kind of new books that I didn't know about. And what I was going to talk about is one of those, and that's The Prisoner of Zenda. This is a kind of book I probably wouldn't have picked up on my own. It's kind of swashbuckling adventure book. You follow a man who is an aristocrat in England, and somewhere in his ancestral line, one of his ancestors hooked up with the king of Ruritania, which is a made-up kingdom somewhere in Europe. And he decides for a holiday he's going to go to Ruritania and just see what the country's like. And when he shows up, it turns out that he looks exactly like the current king. And so he ends up getting mistaken for the king. And when the king can't attend his coronation, he agrees to step in as his doppelganger, and adventures ensue. It's really fun. It's even a bit more realistic than I would have expected, except for the kingdom being fictional. And I just thought it was a really good, fun, short read. So if you're looking for something really kind of short, sweet, and fun, that's a great adventure book. The next book I wanted to talk about is a bit more in the line of serious fiction. That is Fictions, or Ficciones, I think is how it's pronounced, by Jorge Luis Borges. And I will have to admit, I didn't think I would enjoy this book. It's on a list of the best books of all time that I found on Goodreads, and they got the list from the World Library. This is one of the books on the list, and I knew it was modern, and a lot of times I don't like modern fiction because, quite frankly, I'm very basic. I like a happy ending. I tend to not like much modern fiction because most of it's dour, depressing, that sort of thing. And that's kind of what I expected with this. And yet, when I read it, it was like nothing I've ever read before in the best way. This is a collection of short stories, and it is very trippy. It's almost like reading a surrealist painting, if that makes sense. But that'd be the kind of thing that I think Borges would have said. It has just lots of really, like I said, surrealistic, unusual short stories. Probably the most famous short story in this collection is The Library of Babel, which is about a library that is infinite and goes on forever, which what book lover doesn't love the sound of that? And it has every permutation of any book in any language that has been or could be written in any language. So somewhere in this library is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. But how do you find it? Because it's infinite. So it kind of becomes a metaphor for our search for meaning in our existence. It's very powerful, and it's just so different than anything I've ever read. it's well worth a try. It's one of those books, when I got to the last page, I immediately wanted to go back to the first and read it again. And it's pretty short, so I won't say it's easy to read, because it is just so different. You kind of have to wrap your mind around it, but it is a very good book, and it's very worth a read. So give this a shot. I haven't heard anybody talking about this one, so give it a shot. It's something really interesting. The next book that I don't hear a lot about on YouTube or really anywhere is a classic by Henry James, and this is my copy, Daisy Miller. Daisy Miller is a novella. Again, we're talking a very short book. And it covers the story of a young woman who is traveling from New York to Europe to sort of see the sights on vacation. And it's about how she becomes crosswise with the mores and the appearances of modern Europe. She refuses to conform to what the Europeans believe are sort of the appearances she should maintain. So, for example, she goes riding in a carriage with a man unchaperoned. Shock. And there's a great contrast between Daisy's behavior and the behavior of the Europeans. While Daisy's appearances may not be in keeping with public mores, her behavior is. She's innocent of any of the wrongdoing that she's sort of accused of. But the people who are making these accusations, saying, hey, you're looking like a woman of ill repute because of the things that you're doing, they, while their appearances are forthright and look appropriate, they're the ones who are actually doing the things that they are accusing Daisy of. But it's a very, very good book. I find this one of the most feminist books I've ever read, simply because Daisy is wholeheartedly and unapologetically completely herself. She doesn't change who she is or what she does on the basis of what anyone else thinks. And Daisy Miller in this book is also sort of a cipher for America, contrasting the independent spirit of America against the more traditional conservative European mores. So it's really an interesting book. I will say Henry James's writing style is difficult to kind of get along with at first. He does kind of have a difficult writing style, but he is worth it. If you have never read this, please, stick with it, give it a shot. It's very short, so you can kind of get acclimated to it pretty quick. It's a great novel, great characters, really fun. The next book I want to talk about is a little bit more than a book. It's actually more of an author, and that is Anne McCaffrey. Specifically, I chose Dragonflight, the first book in the Pern series, and Anne McCaffrey was a very, very popular writer when I was growing up, in the late 80s to mid 90s. And you found her books everywhere, and you still do find her books everywhere. You find them in the used bookstore, by the droves. And she was a female writer at a time when that wasn't terribly common in fantasy or science fiction. And she created this world called Pern. Anne McCaffrey would argue that it was science fiction because she had a scientific basis for everything that happened in her books. But most people would call her fantasy, even though she didn't particularly care for that. They would call her fantasy, and it feels like fantasy. The world of Pern has dragons. It's kind of a medieval type society with guilds and roaming bards called harpers that are part of the political system, lords and ladies, that kind of thing. So it definitely has a very fantasy feel. And Anne McCaffrey used to be, so highly regarded and so well known that I would come across her works even in my middle school English class. They published one of her short stories in my literature book. And I just don't hear it talked about anymore. I did a search once on YouTube and there were I think 2 people who I could even find that mentioned her. So if you've never given any of Anne McCaffrey's books a shot, I'd really, really recommend them. She has such an easygoing writing style. It's really easy to get into this. You have the Pern series, you have the Dragonflight, Dragon Quest, and the White Dragon. And then she wrote what she called the Harper Hall trilogy, which is a young adult trilogy set in the same world. And if you're just wanting to dip your toe in, that's a pretty good way to kind of get acquainted with her style. They're very, very short and easy to read, and it's a great story as well. She also wrote a series of books called the Crystal Singer books that I think are really good. They're more traditional science fiction. They kind of take place in another world, but it's much more intergalactic space travel kind of novel. That one's about a woman who becomes what they call a crystal singer on this planet that develops a symbiotic relationship with anybody who lives on it, granting them a very extended life, but also over time their memory kind of fades, and they due to the work they do cutting crystals, and there's just a lot of interesting stuff about it. If they leave the planet, then they eventually have to come back or they're going to die. So that's another good series as well. Check out Anne McCaffrey. She's still a valid author today. Her themes still fit today. They're just really good books. The next book I wanted to talk about is a book I have literally heard no one anywhere talk about. No one. And this is a book I picked up on a clearance shelf in my local bookstore. And it is called First Contract. It's a play on words with, the famous First Contact. And it's by Greg Costikyan. I'll put it up here so you can see. Greg Costikyan, I think is how you would say that. But it is a humorous science fiction novel, and as you can see, I also bought it without the dust cover. Sorry. I read this. It's a humorous science fiction novel about a Earth where aliens have made contact with us. They aren't out to kill us. They aren't out to be benevolent gods. They are merely very like us, but more technologically advanced. So what do? They come to take our resources and bail out. And this leaves Earth's economy in a ruin. And so we follow a businessman in this story who was a CEO of a company and was always kind of a shystery type. And he's trying to figure out a way, by hook or by crook, to save Earth's economy, which sounds very serious, but it's not at all. It's a very funny book. Eventually looking to figure out a way we can fit in this new intergalactic economy. And he decides to do this kind of by making cheap crap, like many third world countries do today for more developed nations. Making things, cheap things that we buy to just throw away and dispose of. It's a really funny book, but it's also got that kind of serious undercurrent of, anti-colonial message and anti-consumerist message and a sort of a commentary on the way we've treated indigenous peoples throughout the past. So it's good that it's lighthearted and fun, but yet still has kind of that serious undercurrent. And it's a really, really good read. So if you get a chance and you find a copy of this, I'd highly recommend it. The next book that I also found on the clearance shelves for $3 was this book by Tanith Lee called Electric Forest. This is a science fiction novel, and in it we follow a woman who is born into a society where everyone is genetically engineered to be beautiful, perfectly beautiful, thin, pretty, perfect hair, perfect skin, except for a very few people who are born the old-fashioned way with no genetic engineering. And we follow a woman who's one of those people. And not only was she born not pretty, she was born very ugly and deformed. And in this world, she has no love. No one will talk to her, be her friend, anything, because she's so different and so hideous. And a man comes along and offers her an opportunity to have her consciousness downloaded into a organic biocomputer body that looks just like a real human. It's a really interesting commentary on society and beauty, and it has an epilogue in it that's really controversial. I won't tell you what happens at epilogue because, one, it is kind of a twist in the tale, and I don't want to spoil it for you. But various people have various feelings on that epilogue. I'm pro epilogue, so if you read this and you have an opinion on it, share in the comments below what you think, if you're pro epilogue or con epilogue. But this is really a fun read by Tanith Lee, another science fiction writer who was female when that wasn't terribly common. Finally, I have my horror novel, which is Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber. Fritz Leiber mainly wrote sword and sorcery stories, like Farved and the Grey Mouser was one of his, big stories. But I had picked this up, I think it was around Halloween time, and I was looking for kind of a spooky story to read. And this book was really, really good. It's about a society. By the way, he wrote this in 1950, I believe. Let's see, I'll check. I take it back. It was a little later than that. 1968. No, I'm sorry. Copyright 1953. Copyright 1953. So it looks like it was written in 1953. And it's about a society here on Earth that takes place in the context of university life. If you're looking for something dark academia, this definitely fits. We follow a professor and his wife. And in this society, women are all witches, but they hide it from their husbands. And the main character, Tanzi, is a witch herself, and she gets caught by her husband practicing her spells. And her husband tells her this is foolish, this is sentimentalism, superstition, put that away, stop doing that. And then bad things start to happen to her husband. And it takes sort of the idea of there being, behind every good man, there's a good woman, to kind of an extreme. And it's really, the writing in it is really creepy, which of course you want it to be in a horror novel, especially towards the end. It's not scary. I'm a big weenie when it comes to horror. That's why I don't read a lot of horror. But this is more like the spooky type of horror than the gory or anything like that. But it is a really good spooky story, and it's a very different kind of plot device than I would have ever thought of. So go and check it out. Conjure Wife by Fritz Leiber. You can probably find this in like the pulp section of your local bookstore. That's where I think I got it, but it's a really interesting read. So that's it. Have you heard of these books before? Was I the only one that hadn't heard them talked about? put your thoughts in the comments below as to what books you think are unsung heroes that people aren't talking about enough, and if you've heard of these. Thanks so much, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell. See you next time. Bye.